Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for the 2021 Bono Wiener Memorial Lecture. In Nomen von dem Bund will ich anerkennen die traditionelle Abhitel von dem Land, wo wir treffen sich heint in Abend, das Bunverong-Volk von dem Kullenvolk, und wir geben ab Covid-Sere Imes und Aves von dem Avel, von dem Ossid und Zukünftige. On behalf of the Bund, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which each of us find ourselves this evening, for many of us being the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Just a few housekeeping notes for this evening before we begin. Please make sure that your cameras are switched off so that we are able to see Nyadol and Arnold clearly. Please also make sure that your microphone is on mute so that we are able to hear clearly without distraction. There will also be a Q&A at the end of this event where you will be able to ask questions. Please send through your questions directly to me, Bund Skiff, for this evening as a private message, not in the group chat, as a private message to Bund Skiff, and we will be able to hopefully answer as many questions as possible this evening. I will pass over to this evening's host and master of ceremonies, Arnold Zable.
Curate the...
Yeah.
You're on mute.
Yeah. I didn't put it on mute.
Kate and Mick, can you go on mute? I think it is. Right. Okay. Sorry. So here we are. Look, welcome to the 2021 Bono Wiener Memorial Lecture. We're absolutely thrilled, Nyadol, that you're going to be the lecturer this year. And just say a few words about Bono Wiener. I think in some ways there are many parallels between you and Bono, Nyadol. Bono was a lifelong fighter for justice, for equality, a man who absolutely abhorred and fought against racism and anti-Semitism. Even here in Melbourne in the 1950s and 1960s, as a newly arrived migrant, he would go down to the Yarra where the fascists would sometimes gather and make speeches and stir up trouble, and he would confront them directly. He was born in Lodz, Poland in 1920, and his parents were active in the Jewish Labour Bund, a mass movement which, among many other things, defended their communities against anti-Semitism and attacks. Then at the outbreak of the war, he was incarcerated in the Lodz ghetto, and here he became a charismatic, forthright leader at the age of 19-20. He led the cultural resistance within the Bund movement in the Lodz ghetto. He also shared a secret radio with Avram Goldberg, who's still alive today, they communicated with, and would have been executed if they were caught. They were communicated with the resistance beyond the ghetto, and it brought a lot of hope and also some liaison between groups within and without the ghetto. He even kept up his resistance in Auschwitz. He went to Auschwitz not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to accompany his aunt. When he was there, again, he joined the resistance. He once told me that he traded soap for food because soap and keeping clean enabled him to maintain his dignity. And Then post-war, like many Bundists, he tried to rebuild the Jewish communities in Poland, but he escaped finally in 1948 when the totalitarian Soviet regime was coming to power. And finally arrived in Australia in 1951, worked as a labourer, on the railways for a while, finally settled in Melbourne, and here he became an activist, a fiery orator, a builder of institutions, the co-founder of the Holocaust Centre, a co-founder of the Shalom Aleichem Yiddish Day School, an ardent lover and promoter of the Yiddish language. His house in Elwood was a place where you could always go for a political discussion and for a sense of family and community. He loved his whiskey and his brother loved his vodka. Yes, he was he had a visceral hatred of totalitarianism, he came to love Australia. This is one of the things that we'll be discussing, your experience of arriving as a refugee in Australia and how that rollercoaster experience has been. But I thought when Nyadol and I were discussing tonight's lecture, we decided that we'd do it as a conversation, make it a bit more intimate, and follow the journey of Nyadol's life. And in introducing Nyadol, what she has accomplished in the relatively short time she's been on this planet is quite extraordinary. Among many other things, Nyadol is a lawyer, human rights advocate, public speaker, media commentator, anti-racist activist, and chair of Harmony Alliance, Migrant and Refugee Women for Change, a national coalition of migrant and refugee women in Australia. She was born in a refugee camp in Ethiopia. We'll hear more about her time in Africa soon. She arrived aged 18 in Australia as a refugee, and since then she has completed a Bachelor of Arts from Victorian University, a Juris Doctor from the University of Melbourne, worked as a commercial litigator and public interest lawyer with Arnold, Bloch and Liebler from 2016 to 2021. And her awards include the 2018 Australian Human Rights Commission's Racism It Stops With Me Award for her efforts to combat racism, the 2019 Victorian Premier's Award for Community Harmony for her outstanding achievements in strengthening multiculturalism through professional and volunteer service to the community, and a Harmony Alliance Award for her significant contribution to empowering migrant and refugee women. She is also the co-winner of the Tim McCoy Prize for Advocacy on behalf of the South Sudanese community. The list goes on. The final thing I'd like to say by way of introduction is that Nyadol is an accomplished writer. I love the way she writes. She writes forthright. She's not afraid to express her opinion, and she certainly cops a lot for that. And it's been my wish, I've discussed this with Nyadol from time to time, that she finally complete this amazing book she's got within her about her extraordinary life's journey. And we'll begin, Nyadol, by going back to your childhood and tell us a little bit about that extraordinary early years of yours in Ethiopia and elsewhere in Africa.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for attending this sort of conversation, not necessarily a lecture. I have to say, just with the background, I don't think it's comparable at all, my own journey. The beginning of my sort of memory about early childhood has a lot of gaps. But through conversations with mom and others, I know that I was born in a refugee camp in Itang soon after the civil war in the Sudan broke out. And about 1991, another civil war broke out in Ethiopia. And so we were displaced back to Sudan, the country that is now South Sudan. and then got separated from my mother, and I ended up in second refugee camp, Kakuma refugee camp. And that's where I sort of grew in and out. I started my primary school in Kakuma, and I undertook all of my secondary studies, which is in Kenya, 4 years of secondary studies in the camp. And just before I was able to finish that, we got accepted through the humanitarian entry to come to Australia. So that was it was just at the nick of time, because I was getting to the last year of my secondary education, and I knew there was no way I could pursue further studies, because being in a refugee camp, my mom could not afford university fees in Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya. So yeah, I mean, from about early 90s to 1996, I saw my mother once, and it was in 96 when we had received news that my father had been killed in the conflict. And then she went back to Ethiopia, where the rest of my family members were. And I sort of didn't start living with her until early 2000s, when we began our application for humanitarian resettlement to Australia. So that's probably, yeah, the escape of my early childhood.
Well, what strikes me, Nyadol, about your early childhood is that it was the women that kept the family together, and that it was the men. It was a time of absentee fathers. Conflict, and so I wanted to explore that a bit. Your mentors and the strength of the women in very difficult circumstances. Kakuma, for example, has got a reputation as a very, very difficult place to spend time in, the largest refugee camp in the world. So can you speak about that?
Yeah, it's because I think most of the men were involved in the guerrilla movement in the Sudan. And so most of the people that got displaced into refugee camps were just women and children. And so I have only one memory of interacting with my father. Beside that, I have no memories of him, because he was constantly back and forth and spent less than a few weeks whenever we got to see him. And even when he was around, he was in business, political and military meetings. So didn't know a lot about my father. And in fact, most of what I know about him is from what I hear other people tell me, because apparently I look very much like him. So when I go back to places like South Sudan or Kenya, or even here in Australia, when I run into other Sudanese people who know the history of South Sudan, they would then tell me stories about him, of meeting him. And that's how I've built an idea of who he is. And in a way, I think when I was younger, I tried to not replicate, but maybe create moments. I knew things like his favorite car was a Jeep. So I grew up wanting to get a Jeep. And I knew that he used to like drinking Sprite. And for a long time, I drank Sprite as my favorite drink, because it was just this feeling of wanting to have some connection with this person. And but I think the women, in a way, provided consistent support. So even when I wasn't with my mother, I was moved around stepmothers, and those were the people that supported me through all my life. And thankfully, with my mom, I think in the South Sudanese community, people know my father because of his profile, but I tell people all the time that I am my mother's daughter, because I think she is the one that put in a lot of the effort and made a lot of the sacrifices day to day. So in Kakuma, I used to walk for about an hour or so just to get to school one way, and even though we didn't have a lot of money, she bought me a bicycle, and it just felt as though someone believed enough in me in a way that only a parent can. And I knew what a huge sacrifice it was, because we needed that money for other things. And and I know that my mother as well is sort of even with all the trauma she experienced, the biggest gift she gave us as her daughters is the idea of transformation through education, because she was taken out of school at 16 and was forced to marry my father. And she sort of made a promise to herself that she would never repeat that. She will not force her daughters to be married, and she had relative power to sort of coerce us into that decision, because in a camp, and especially in our culture as a widow, it's easy to be forced to marry off your daughter so that people can get the dowry. But she was very insistent on us getting an education and supporting that in whichever way she could. So I mean, at some point, if we get a chance, I would like to sort of mention a story that I ended up writing about my mother and my grandmother, and how these two women in some ways have sort of laid the foundation for what the rest of us are able to achieve today.
Look, I think it's just such a central thread in what you, in who you are, that disconnection that you received from such an early age with strong women. I mean, Kakuma was a place where I guess you had the extremes of violence and kindness. It was a vast camp, wasn't it, Kakuma?
It was a huge camp, a very big camp. No, I remember people fighting over water because the only running water was twice a day, very early in the morning, and then around 5 p.m. And that was the only drinking water that was available. And people would fight over there. But I think I also saw a lot of leadership in my mom. I know there was an intertribal conflict, and everybody was in a way hiding in their rooms, because the young men fighting and the men fighting targeted everybody, and mom was walking around trying to resolve it, trying to resolve the conflict in the Nuer community at the time. And I remember looking through a window, because there's this I wish I'd actually brought it with me, but there's a traditional dress that you tie over your clothing as a form of modesty, and it's called a lawe, and the wind would just pick up the lawe, and she literally looked in my head like superwoman, because he is a woman walking in the middle of people throwing stones and spears trying to resolve this conflict. And so in a way, she demonstrated that courage and that leadership. And she's always, in some ways, she's been able to stand up when things got really tough. And I know she was one of the only women that spoke up when a woman was bashed to death by her family member, her in-laws, because they claimed that she had bewitched her husband. And so they essentially murdered this woman, and everybody was quiet, and my mom was the only person who publicly protested and threw a tantrum and abused people and called people out, and she ended up being physically assaulted because of it. But it just these moments of just true courage that she was able to demonstrate.
Yeah, I think we learn a lot about who you've become just hearing your description of your mother. Now, in 2005, you arrive in Australia, 18 years old. You've written very eloquently about this and spoken very eloquently, but can you take us to that moment of arrival and those first few weeks? What was your sense, your first impression, your first sense of being here?
It's definitely felt like utopia. Like I thought I had arrived in heaven in some ways. I was desperate to get out of that camp. I was desperate to make something of myself, and I knew how crushing the realities of refugee camps are, crushing to any dreams that you might have. And so the opportunity to even think that these things were now possible, to go to university, to to sleep in a comfortable bed, to have food in the fridge, very simple things. I was very, very excited to finally arrive here. And we sort of landed in March, just as sort of summer was ending. It was still a bit warm, and I remember driving through the Melbourne tunnel and just in amazement at what this new life could be. I also ate a lot of KFC chicken because that was just like the welcoming food. And I never thought I could get tired of eating KFC chicken. I finally got tired of it. I think my brain is settled to understanding it's not going to run out. But it I came with fire in my belly. I wanted to get every single opportunity available to me to take it on, to try and get as much as out of it as I can. In a way, maybe to acknowledge my mother's sacrifices, because I know my mother never necessarily wanted to come to Australia. She's a very capable woman in South Sudan. She understands how that community works, despite its, darkness and its lights. And so she could have survived there. And so in a way, I knew the sacrifice she was making, it was entirely for us to have a better life. And also because I had friends my age that I left in the camp that I knew the only difference between me and them was the fact that they didn't have the opportunities that I had. They were as intelligent, as ambitious, as creative, as lively as anyone that you can meet anywhere in this country. The only difference was that they didn't have the opportunities that I now got to have. So that just kept the fire going.
Tell me something we may explore a bit more later, but the other side of it is this the trauma that, and certainly we just know so well within our own communities. I know from my own parents that, the trauma they carried with them, and different people handle it very differently, of course, and there's no one size fits all. But was there, within your own family and your own self, it must have been an extraordinary moment, that those first few months, in terms of what you had come from, what you'd experienced, what you carried with you?
I think for me, I only began to notice patterns of trauma in the last few years. And I think partly because even when we arrived here, we were still in survival mode, and you didn't have sort of the luxury and the permission to explore your feelings and your struggles. And in a way, I can't speak for other members of my family. I can say that I've witnessed, I now can identify how trauma has really impacted our life, even here in Australia. And you asked me this question even 3 years ago, I would have said, just because you've been through what doesn't mean that you have trauma. Like I couldn't identify how trauma had impacted some of my thinking, some of my processes through life. And it's been in the last, and it's probably for me personally, it was sparked by finally having my own kids. I had found a way of putting away all the childhood trauma, all the separation, all the emotional, the physical, and the yet unspoken trauma. I had found a way of, I don't know, just compartmentalizing it and just going on with life. And I think after having my daughter, just the sense of vulnerability that comes from being a parent and from seeing something or someone that in a way relies on you for all protection, began to sort of make me realize how vulnerable I had been in the past, and how things that had happened to me as a child were definitely demonstrated in my own life as an adult now. And I remember dropping my my daughter off to childcare for the first time, and having now what I think was a panic attack, and ending up throwing up in my mouth, because I just felt though if I went back and pick her up, she's not going to be okay. And for the first time, I think it just felt so vulnerable. And I think that for me is when I began to think about how trauma defines us even when we don't think it does. And so I have been working through that, and I'm still working through that. And a friend recently gave me a perspective that helps me sort of carry the the realization of the trauma and the depth of trauma. And she said, perhaps finally your body and your mind knows that it is safe and it can begin to go there. And so it is not all bad things. It is also a good thing, because your body is telling you perhaps you've reached a level of safety that allows you to have those conversations. Because when you're still in survival mode, those conversations just don't occur. You just don't have the luxury of that. You're just surviving day to day. So that is definitely a story to explore, Arnold. And I think in some ways, I'm so grateful I never wrote that book. You know, the book that we're talking about when we first met in 2012, because it would have been shallow in some ways, because I hadn't even started looking at the things that trauma does to individuals and to communities. And because of that, because of the conversations I've been able to have with myself and what I am trying to face now in terms of building a different life from just a life of survival, is a greater appreciation for who my mother is and for how much she held herself together despite facing things that are really hard. Because I think as a child, we expect a lot out of our parents, almost in a sense as if they have to heal us and they have to take us through that process. And until you go through your own processes, you can have a very angry, very one-sided view of what it means to be a parent and what a parent can actually give you. And I think now I love my mom in a much more deeper way than I've ever done before, because I finally can see what it is like to live with trauma. And I know in a way that she doesn't get to have the chance and the luxury to explore what healing looked like, you know. And I think a part of me is really sad about that.
You know, it's extraordinary, Nyadol. It sounds so familiar to many of us in this audience, what you've just spoken about. Of course, it's different and it's specific as well. But yeah, a lot of families in our communities, I think you shed light on the way in which, you know, our parents, to varying degrees, went into that survival mode. They just got to get on with it, you know, and then later on, things began to surface. And we could explore that, you know, for a long time. But let's move on, because I now want to shift to something else. And okay, so, you know, you arrived, it's a kind of utopia. It's there's a certain innocence in those first few, that first period, but then something else, of course, begins to intrude, and you start to become aware of the darker side of being here in Melbourne. And so not only you personally, but also the community. But I want us to focus first on you personally. When did you start to feel the other side of the equation?
Probably
The racism, to put it bluntly, I guess.
2 years in. So 2007, the media coverage began, and it was a lot of what's focused around Noble Park, around African young people hanging around train station, hanging in groups. You know, I remember once coming from a basketball training session in Springvale and getting down at Noble Park train station, and there were policemen there. They were not officers, like they were not transportation officers. They were actually policemen, and they let everybody else go except us, the Black kids. And they asked us for what's it, like whether we had tickets. And I was in the train. I was actually sitting with a group of boys, and one of them were throwing things at each other, and one threw his wallet at his friend. So by the time we got out, he was still holding his friend's wallet, and I think the police asked him, notice it, and I say, whose wallet is that? So it's my friends. They're like, oh, did you steal it? And the way they spoke to us and the way they humiliated us, you could just see everybody else passing by, and it was all the Black kids were being asked to to step to the side was this assumption that we were a danger. And I remember getting just so angry and shaking with anger. And as we finally, they let us go, as we were walking away, one of the boys said, "Oh, is this your first time?" He said, "I've had experiences where the police have like released their dogs on me." And I just cried. I just remember just crying out of sheer powerlessness. And so now that's what he alleges. I don't know to what extent that's necessary, but that was the story. And I know that kid enough to know I would probably trust him. And what was also sad was the acceptance that they demonstrated of that treatment, that it was, this is what they were going to get. And that was all. And so the media just kept getting worse in terms of politicians began getting in. And I remember just being so afraid of picking up newspapers because there was a sense of dislocation that happens every time you read those stigmatizing articles. You know, I think war displaces you physically, but when you come to a country like Australia, you mentally think this can be home. And there's this mental sort of displacement that keep occurring when you read these articles and feeling as though, oh, maybe I'm going to get kicked out. Maybe this country doesn't like people like me. So that's when I became really aware of just the impact that the media was having, and just reading some of those comments online that some of them were violent. And so because you'd witness violence, I think it's very different when you see a violent threat, when you've seen violence and violence has been acted on you. The way you react to that comment, and someone who might have grown up here and never witnessed violence constantly, I think it's very different. So for me, those comments felt real. They felt as though they could be someone at the train stop or someone, you know, who just doesn't like black kids. And so it just I became quite aware that early that things weren't as necessarily they seem. And like those boys, for a long time, I accepted it. I thought, you know, I'm a refugee, I got displaced. This is, you know, this is a country that was kind enough to take me in. Maybe the price you pay for that is to be treated this way.
You know, it's interesting, Nyadol, that today, and you also wrote this on your Twitter, there was an article published in The Age just today about a report called Place, Race and Politics, the Anatomy of a Law and Order Crisis. It was very interesting to read because it was a very precise summary, in a way, the report of something that happened. It came and it sort of went, and it was, you know, a campaign which, you know, surfaced, according to the report, in 2015 in the Murdoch Press, when the first of the articles about African gangs, the Apex gang was the first one, characterized as race-based, which it wasn't entirely anyway, and then it began. And I do want to touch on, just very briefly, some of the moments, because we can forget. Matthew Guy, leader of the Liberal Party, began using this as part of the election campaign. He said that Melbourne was becoming the Johannesburg of the South Pacific. You know, I think the lowest point was Peter Dutton saying in 2018, and really fanning the flames by saying Melburnians are too scared to go out to dinner. And then, you know, many articles saying the South Sudanese are failing to integrate, and all of this intensified as the election campaign approach. Now, can you tell us a little bit about that period and how it impacted you and the wider community?
I ended up writing an article for the Saturday paper on the demonizing effect of racism, because to me, it felt like being in a siege, because it was inescapable. It was just, if you happen to be Black at that time, there was a way that I almost wanted to shed my skin. You walk into a restaurant, there was a front page paper of African gangs, you know, it's just, you became so visible. And I remember trying to overcompensate by every time I go into a public space, just being overtly nice, you know, just smiling, just trying to somehow threaten people from me. Like, I automatically begin to believe that I look threatening. And, you know, it might seem like an overreaction, but when you know that Black kids were being kicked out of libraries that had not done anything because, they wanted to create a perception of safety, which means Blackness had now been connected to not being safe, that you had to move on, kids who have not done anything just because being Black was now seen as a potential threat. And I think what hurt most to me, at least, it was because it was predominantly what seemed like a political strategy, and the carelessness of not caring about what happened to the people at the end of that. Even today, I just really struggle with how you can do that to another human being, how you could, in a way, engage in a process of destroying a whole community because of the conduct of some people, knowing inherently that you are using it as a political toy. And if there was something there, perhaps, you could be forgiving, but it's really hard to know that most of these politicians politicize it to sort of take advantage of fear and ignorance to some degree, and that they left behind this really crushed community. People were losing jobs or not getting employed. The Human Rights Commission reported a 34% increase in reporting on racial incidents. It became just common to see really hateful things online, curl them, deport them all, let's shoot them. This is why in South Africa they were ruled with an iron fist, and all the racist stuff that came out. And until today, in a way, they don't care. In the Sudanese community, we're seeing a high rate of young people dying by suicide. We're seeing a group of young people that seem to be somehow demoralized. And I think that is a part of it that is linked to this campaign. And that's what is sort of visible. I think what is invisible is two parts. The first is the immediate effect on African communities because of the policies that have been adapted off the back of this narrative. How the immigration is sort of almost curled to a still any intake from Africa, including people being able to reunite with their family members. How young people from African background, it's now created literally a pipeline where a young person from an African background on a visa commits a crime, doesn't matter how bad that crime is, automatically is a pipeline to being put in a detention center for deportation. These are young people that came here at 3-4 year olds, and it's like, for me, there is an inherent question about that, about equality before the law. It is one thing to punish somebody for the wrongdoing under the law, but to add the additional punishment of deportation and detention seems like a very an overkill in some instances, particularly because in some cases it doesn't even take account of what the crime is. It just takes account of whether or not it's a crime that would have been a jail term of 1 year or more, and that can be a very low bar. And so it's all those things that are happening. And I think one of the things that the articles outline is the second underlining impact that it has on our community. I think those kind of narratives have ensured tremendous funding into the police force and the over-policing of now everybody in some ways. And this is how, in my view, why standing up for racism and anti-Semitism is important, because these things tend to happen by those who are most vulnerable, but they do tend to find their way, or some expression of their way, to even people who think that, they're safe. That we're safe because of their skin color or not. So stopping it at that stage is far more important, because I think it erodes our own societal expectation of what it means, of what equality before the law means. What kind of power should police have? How should that power be exercised? All those questions, I think, are thrown up. And I think that has happened with the Sudanese community. And I also think it has happened in terms of, things like the war on terror, and how those things have eroded the high expectations we have about respect for human rights.
And thank you, Nyadol.
Just cut me off if I'm going on and on.
No. You've taken us into the visceral experience of what racism does, and yes, a lot of damage too. And now I want to shift to the other side of the equation in a way, and that is, I think one thing that I've learned about my interactions, and I've been privileged to have some interaction with some leaders in the African community, and I've come to see it's a community that actually knows how to organize. There's a lot of community. There are a lot of skills in the community. I think there are interesting reasons where those skills come from. They come from a certain way of being and living. It goes back many centuries. But there is a. So, can you tell me, first of all, on the personal level, when did you decide to become active in this space, to take it on, and maybe then also a little bit about the way in which the South Sudanese community and perhaps the broader African community, how it's responded to this in terms of the way they've organised their responses and confronted it and formed alliances, etc.
I think I'll probably start with the broader community. I think the Victorian election and the way the Victorian community responded by not buying into that campaign was such a powerful moment for South Sudanese community, but I think for the rest of our community, in that it says, this is cheap politics, have some grounds on crime, of course, but this is cheap politics. And I think that was really reaffirming. In terms of the Sudanese communities, we are a very collectivist society, and I think that has its advantages and to some degree its disadvantages. I think the way you would see Sudanese community respond in a time of crisis is almost as if everybody forget that they have their own personal issues. Every time a family member loses anybody, you visit their home and their home is taken over by community members who clean, who cook, who sit down and mourn with the person. And hundreds of people come through those rooms to do their part. Well, people bring in food and other people bring in drinks and other, it's a very collective response. And also, how many people are stepping up for other people's children, to look after them if they have nobody to look after them. The amount of voluntary work that happens in our community in terms of the community local organizations. Majority of these organizations that get funding. I'll come change it. No, you can't change it. That's not going to work out well. Sorry, my daughter is 5 and she's saying that she's going to change her brother, which I think is going to be a disaster. No, but yeah, so I think the amount of voluntary work in our community is massive and it's so underfunded, and people are doing it out of their own need. And even the voluntary work, in terms of the advocacy work that I've done, majority of that work is not paid work. And in fact, I know that most of us in our community in fact are sort of socially and financially worse off because we're spending so much time trying to do the community work that wouldn't happen without people sort of volunteering their time. And so there is a very big disconnect between the public narrative about South Sudanese communities and how our community is operating. There are single moms, working at aged care that have bought homes in this kind of economic environment where all of us are struggling to buy homes. These amazing stories. There are women who are moving their whole families to places like the Northern Territory, Alice Spring, to get a job to support their family members. Yet the public narrative is of this sort of welfare dependence, this whole gap and these whole other stories that are happening that don't get as much insight. Then in terms of personal response, I don't think there was a time where I ever said, now I'm going to get involved. I think I just got pissed off and frustrated and started saying things, and then people started perhaps listening, and then some of the media organizations that were willing to offer their platform or share that platform or get me to write articles, and sort of that's how the advocacy stuff, the public advocacy stuff happened. But in terms of other works. I think we were always doing things. I say we because the culture of volunteering is such an ingrained culture in the South Sudanese community. In fact, it's not even named as volunteering, it's just something that you do. We were always doing things like that in terms of organizing communities since our arrival.
You know, there's so much we can explore here, but I can see time is going on. So much to tease out. But given these time limits, I wanted to shift to something else. You know, one of the things, very impressive things about your journey and what you are now offering us as a community is that you've spoken a lot, especially quite recently, about our need to reimagine Australia.
Yeah.
Our need to shift the narrative, not necessarily to change it, because you know the issue of multiculturalism has evolved over many years. And but can you say a bit about that? What is your vision in this respect?
I think that there are things that I'm still thinking through, but where I am at the moment is recognizing that I am no longer exclusively Sudanese nor exclusively Australian, and that I feel that I am fed by both communities in a way that can be constructive. You know, so as a South Sudanese woman, come from a relatively conservative society. I'm too loud for a South Sudanese woman. I'm probably too feminist for, you know, a South Sudanese woman, even for my mother sometimes, who I think is probably a feminist, but she wouldn't call herself that. And so there is a part of me that comes alive in this country because of what this country is built on, these ideas of freedom of expression and everything else. But then there is a part of me that was formed in those refugee camps, that was fed and educated about life and sacrifice and giving by the women that I grew up with. And so when I think about what it means to be an Australian in modern Australia, is how do we broaden the conversation about who is Australian to be able to capture all these complexities that I think we all bring, you know, that I think communities that have settled here over years bring in, you know, and as much as I can go back to South Sudan, there's a part of me that I feel I've left in Australia, and there's a part of me that feels I've left in South Sudan. And I think, you know, I think that the conversation that we have about who is Australian is still predominantly very Eurocentric. And I think that limits our ideas about what is possible in this country, not only in terms of Indigenous Australian, but I think in terms of broadly all the other communities that are present here. So the conversations that I would hope to see becoming is how do we take the concept of multiculturalism and mature it in a way that it finds expressions in our national identity, in our institutions, whether it you know, whether it's in terms of the constitutions or in terms of election to parliaments and the media, is how do we really begin to look like the kind of Australia that we say is the most successful multicultural society in the world. And I think those are not only questions about Australia, I think those are questions about, I might be wrong, but I think in a way, the West, in some ways of liberal democracies, in the United States, and in the United States with the election of Donald Trump, in Britain with Brexit, is how are we defining national identities, you know, who get incorporated in those national identities, and therefore who get protected as a citizen of a country. And I think how we resolve those questions have historically suggested whether or not we can be cohesive societies. And perhaps, in my view, the current political tensions and the current political debates is raising up some of those, re-raising some of those questions that in the past have been a great source of harm, whether it's through things like racism or anti-Semitism or war. And I don't think it's ridiculous to think that the stakes are are getting higher and higher in terms of the current political process happening in the liberal democracies that were seen in some ways as defining what the priorities of the world are supposed to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As I said, I'm still thinking through some of this.
Look, I think what you've been talking about is, on the one hand, it's exciting, really exciting. This is the challenge that we face too. You know, this love for our own culture, our own language, and Bono was a key in rebuilding communities and keeping that thread going. And I think it's fair to say what we have to offer. We have to offer, and on the other hand, also, you know, how we integrate and become a harmonious society. But you're right. You have said, to quote you again, we are living in unprecedented times that call for a different kind of action and alternative narratives. And I think I am excited about it. I think we should be excited about it, but also it's a scary time, and we can't. And you know, we can't have any illusions about that. Now, I want to open it up for questions, but I wanted to explore one last thing. You have returned, haven't you? Or not returned? You have gone to Sudan.
I have, yeah.
And can you? It must have been an extraordinary experience going to Sudan. Were you even tempted to stay there, or what was?
So I went there during the referendum when the South was deciding whether or not it would remain in Sudan or become an independent state. And because, you know, in a way, it's sort of finding your own roots in because my father was involved in the guerrilla movement. I sort of, and his dream was to have an independent state, an independent South. I went there to vote in the referendum in a way of sort of honoring his contribution, because he never lived to see it. But I was so, we landed in Juba, in the capital of South Sudan, and we went to the grave of John Garang, who was the leader of the SPLA, which was the political and the military movement for the liberation of the South. He too had died shortly after signing the peace agreement in a plane crash. And I remember being at that, you know, that site and like feeling the most South Sudanese I've ever felt in my life, and being like, this is home. And then we left that site, and I returned again. I wanted to be there for the independence and for the flag raising, for the flag of South Sudan being raised for the first time in an independent state. But this time, as I walked away from it after the celebration, I just felt a little bit out of place. But I also began to question the whole project of an independent South Sudan. Because even then, the sort of problems that became a civil war in the South in 2013 were beginning to emerge, the rampant corruption and tribalism. In a way, we had replaced who we thought were enemies in the North with ourselves. We were now beginning to see ourselves as South Sudanese as potential enemies. And you could see that this country, even as it declared independent, was beginning to collapse. And also because before I had gone to South Sudan, I had gone to Sudan for the first time. I went to Khartoum and I met Sudanese people for the first time, people that I'd only heard negative things about as someone who grew up in the South and who grew up with a father in the war, you know, how they were our enemies and how they wanted to dominate us and take our religious freedoms away. And that was not the case. You know, the South Sudanese people, the Sudanese people there that when you see in the hotels and you see on the street, where there's people like you who wanted to look after their families. And I think I began to see for myself as well, the propaganda in which I grew up and how it diminished not only my humanity, but the humanity of Sudanese fellows that I think that had we given ourselves a chance politically, we could have survived as a country, as one country. It was the politics more than the people that were the problem. And so with those two images in head, I sort of, it began to weaken the black and white image that I'd grown up with. And then the third angle was landing in Melbourne and being handed my Australian passport, which is the only passport I've ever had, and the lady saying, "Welcome home." And it felt like home in a way that South Sudan didn't feel. And that gesture almost brought me to tears that were followed by almost a sense of shame. It's like, I wasn't supposed to feel this was home, because I'd always been raised in refugee camp that wherever you go, you get an education and you go back and build South Sudan. But this was beginning to feel like home, and it felt as though I had betrayed the contributions that my family had given to Sudan. And yeah, so it's a multi-layered issue. And the freedom that you now begin to give yourself as a grown-up about what life that you can have independent of your family's dreams are sort of the new conversations that I'm having, and my children are forcing me to have it again in a very different way.
Yeah. It was wonderful hearing that. Now, I want to open it up for questions. Thank you all for your patience. I felt we really had to hear Nyadol and get some idea of the extraordinary arc of her life. Yes, any questions? And I know that Dvora is going to moderate this.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
And if there are no questions, there are many more waiting here. So
thank you so much. So just a reminder to our audience, if you do have a question, you are more than welcome to send them through to me at Bundskif in the chat. And I'm sure Nyadol and Arnold will be happy to answer as many questions as possible. Don't be shy.
Okay, look, while you're getting your courage together to ask a question or thinking of a question to ask, there is something I want to come back to, and that is, this issue of what is freedom, and also the consequences you face by writing all kinds of articles, including articles recently about what is happening now from the time of COVID. And I should say, I think it should be said that for everything you write, you receive incredible amount of abuse and trolling. Every time you appear on Q&A, it's followed, I believe, by those responses. So we're going back now to a look at the darker side again. Can you talk a little bit about that, about these more recent experiences and that? How it's impacted you.
The writer Toni Morrison says a really interesting quote. Said the true purpose of freedom is to free another person. And I think the joys of growing up in a collectivist society is how much we get to understand that our freedom relies on other people, and appreciating that we are not islands unto ourselves. And I think what gets missed in a society that becomes more and more individualistic is that we begin to define freedom in a very selfish way, a very personal, internal ways. And I think that definition of freedom is insufficient to sustain a society, because I just, there is limits to what my freedoms can be. I can have freedom to drink as much as I want, but I don't have a freedom to get into a car and drive at 120 Ks. Even if I can physically do it, it's probably not wise to do it because I'm going to hurt other people. And I don't know to what extent we've arrived, some of the conversations particularly highlighted by COVID is this definition of freedom that is just so inside looking, and inside looking almost just not even in a sense of what other people experience, but in idea that there is no consequence for the decisions we make. And so that's kind of worrying to see. But in terms of the hate and the abuse, it used to really impact me. I know that there was a time, which is why I'm always going to be grateful that I started off at ABL, because I think they were so understanding about why I felt the need or the urge to do the public work, despite the fact that I could just have put my head down and be a commercial lawyer. And I think that's part of their own history of understanding what racial and religious discrimination look like. And so there was a time I took 3 months off work because the abuse online just became that much, you know, and I just couldn't do it, you know. I couldn't do it. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't take the abuse. I couldn't take the constant negativity. I began getting afraid of even picking my phone up because you just don't know what you're going to come through. And then when it began to even go to my kids and people tracking down my family members and bringing their personal life and struggles to away, but it just became too much. And so I took that time off personally just to sort of recuperate and get back on the on it again. And I also, a time that I was very sure that I was never going to go back into social media, and I think I left for about six months and then returned. Now though, I really predominantly don't care about racist and anti-Semites. I just literally block them immediately, or I just ignore them. And I think in some ways they've also taught me a lesson that I needed to learn, which is, you know, you have to work toward other people not being able to determine so much about how your day feels like and how your response feel like, to the point that they impact your decisions. So I needed to learn that, or I needed to get better at that. And I think they've really taught me to really withstand some really bad abuse and still be able to enjoy my cup of coffee. It's a good thing.
Yeah, it's another thing that we can discuss at greater length. Yeah. Dvora, any questions?
The questions have started popping through. Thank you. Our first question's from a member of the audience who heard you speaking English to your daughter before, and they'd like to know, what role do you feel language plays in your kids' identity, and how much or how important is Sudanese identity, and how much of it do you want for your kids?
Oh, that's it. First of all, I think language is really important, and I'm failing at that. I speak to my kids in English at home. We speak predominantly in English. I wish I could speak to them in Nuer, but it just feels like such an effort when you're the only person speaking Nuer, because they go to school, they speak in English, they go to childcare, they speak in English, with their cousins, they speak in English. So it's almost as if it doesn't normalize. So that's one of the things I really hope to improve on. And I've been encouraging people that understand the Nuer language and the Dinka language in much more details to sort of start like schools, so that I can take my kids and they can formally learn Nuer or learn Dinka. I think it's so important to retain some of that. There is so much history that gets carried on that. I hope that they you know, what I do though is I sing to them a lot in Nuer. And those are songs from my mother, religious songs I learned from my mother. So I hope that's a tradition that we continue to carry on. In terms of what identity they inherit, I think there's some wonderful things in both identities, but I also hope that they get to create their own, something in between being Sudanese and being Australians, or being somewhere in between that, because what works for me wouldn't necessarily work for them. It wouldn't necessarily satisfy all their emotional and spiritual needs or cultural needs. And I don't want to create an environment for them where they feel, I feel they feel like they have to choose, and if they're not choosing, making the right choices, then they're failing. I think they will find out what works for them. And that's going to be tough in some ways, you know, because I have seen some choices that my own siblings, younger siblings, have made, and I didn't agree with them because I probably came from a more Sudanese background, thought they should do this or that. But I can also see why that works for them, because to them, this is the only country they will ever know. South Sudan will always be a place where they visit almost as tourists and come back to Australia. So it's a difficult question. The challenge though for me is that sometimes I do feel as though my kid look visibly Sudanese, but like most South Sudanese young kids that either grow up or are born here, they're more Australian, that their goals, you know, my little sister recently told me she wants to go to London for a year. It was unimaginable when I came here that you could go to London for a year on your own as a young unmarried girl. You know, like that's just a complete change within a generation. And there is something so liberating and powerful about that. But had we hold that to our Sudanese backgrounds, like stay at home until you get married, that's the proper process. So it's this wonderful and also challenging conversations about culture and belonging and identity and place that I don't think I can ever have full answers for. I hope that answers it. Yeah, so
that was fantastic.
Hopefully we work it out.
Thank you, Nyadol. I think that's also a question, Arnold, correct me if I'm wrong, that your parents' generation would have had to face as well upon arriving in Australia. Our next question is, they say, your father was a guerrilla fighter. What is your view on war as a means of obtaining political goals? When is it justified? Tough question.
My aspirational view is that the world get to a place where we don't need wars, where we actually look at war as an inhumane, irrational response to our problems. That's my goal. I would like to see a world in which we literally abolish war. Because the thing about war is that after it all is conversations, human to human conversations that actually heal, that sustain societies. War create more violence. You know, South Sudan, my father were involved in these guerrilla movements that to create a South Sudan that, you know, I think 3-4 years after independence ended up in its own civil conflict again. So I don't know. Do I think that there are times in which war becomes necessary? In exceptionally in self-defense of some form, I would say, but even then, I don't know. I've seen how war destroys so much more than just buildings and life temporarily. It's just one of the most horrible things I think human beings can do to each other. Yeah, so I have a very difficult relationship with my father, history and legacy as that, both as personally for me. I think in many ways he wasn't a great guy, you know, and I think I'm gonna cop a lot if Sudanese people watch this video on YouTube. He was a man who abused his power when he had power. He married my mom forcefully. He killed probably as a soldier, and he was killed through that brutal process. How do you have those difficult conversations? But at the same time, had I been in his position as a 17-year-old boy deciding to embark on this long journey of an idea of freedom and liberation of your people, I mean, for a 17-year-old to sacrifice so much of his life for that, why? And those are questions that I don't know what the answers are for. And then there's the fact that I'm his daughter. So there's always going to be a complex look at that story that is inherently biased and sometimes just angry. You know, in some ways, I wish I had a father that was a father, that I could see, that I knew, that I could hug, that I could tell my children from a personal perspective about who he was.
Thank you, Nyadol. We have one more question. And the question is, after all these things that you've talked about today and all of the initiatives that Arnold mentioned in the intro, what do you plan to pursue next?
When does this video go online? Because I probably just want to.
I'll pause it for you if it's important.
All right. I've just got offered a new role at Victoria University, so that's really exciting. It's a senior leadership role as an executive director for one of the centers. It's not publicly announced yet, so if you're watching this, the 47 of you, please don't make it public before it goes public. But I think, it's probably going to be announced. And so that's what I'm immediately
delete that part.
Yeah. But until recently, I did not know. I did not know what I wanted to do. I mean, I left the law, and it was such a big part of my identity since I was in the refugee camp, wanted to be a lawyer, finally achieved it. And I had to give it up for many reasons, including the fact that I became a single parent of 2 kids, which for me, wanting to achieve the kind of things that I wanted, I knew that my children needed me, and with my own history of not growing up with my parents, I couldn't justify taking even more time out for them. But also, just in terms of what I said earlier on about trauma as well, the good thing about finally feeling safe and secure is also learning to stop running. I think when I first came to this country with that eagerness and hunger, I went from one thing to another. I just kept rushing from one thing to another. And in an article that I wrote for The Guardian about what the pandemic brings as a matter of perspective, one of the things that became clear to me was that in addition to all the things that you had heard about what I've so-called achieved, one of them was going to be collapsing in a heap at some point, because the way I was sort of going from one thing to another was really more a trigger of survival, as opposed to finally stopping and thinking, you are safe, you're okay, you can rest. And for a long time before this opportunity came up, I was happy for the first time to live in the not knowing what it would be, and to realize that that was a safety response, because I had kept running and kept achieving just in the hope that somehow that's going to keep me alive, literally. And so, yeah, what would happen after the VU role, I don't know. I hope to stay there, and I hope to meet all of you in some capacity, because it's a Center for Law and Cultural Diversity. It's about having the very kind of conversation about re-emerging Australia, and its expressions in our institutions, whether it's the media or the parliament. And so it's a very exciting time for me, and also I think a time to finally be able to do what I think many people who experience war don't get to do, to just enjoy and to treat everything that comes from now on as a bonus and a blessing.
Dvora, I'd like to thank Nyadol. It's been extraordinary. And I think one thing, you give so much. I just want to say, you just give so much of yourself, and we have to look out for each other. I think this is not just an hour and then we go in our separate ways. We've got to look out for each other, and we're in it together. Any abuse, any racism that our fellow human beings experience is our own experience. We should own it. We should take responsibility. I want to say that we are there for you as you have been for us.
Oh, thank you.
And that, this is conversation. This is relationship. This is looking each other in the eye and listening to each other and hearing each other's narratives and finding our common humanity. And yes, we're together. We're not going to we're going to fight this abuse. We're going to stand side by side. We're going to be with you. And it's interesting, that question of resistance. It's in our DNA to resist. And so I want to conclude by saying we have an extraordinary respect for what you do, but more than that, for who you are and how willing you are to share that. So yes, you did write that wonderful, wonderful article for The Guardian about how in COVID you were beginning to learn to chill out. And I hope that's very much a part of your life now too, that you can breathe deeply and experience the great joy and the freedom that you've earned on that journey of yours. So thank you so much. It's been an honor to spend time with you, and thank you for your wisdom, your insight, and your willingness to share it with